Blender for Noobs.
Hello, this is Dan Nobles and welcome to Blender for Noobs, and welcome to this lesson on manipulating 3D objects. Also, if you're following the course, this is lesson 3 of the course on Blender 3D modeling for beginners. In this lesson, we're going to be doing a little bit of basic modeling and learning how to manipulate the objects within our 3D geometry. So let's get started. Okay, and so in order to start with this, you should have Blender downloaded and installed. If you don't and you need help with that, I do cover installing Blender, downloading Blender, installing, and the basic setup needed in my previous course, which is Blender 3D for beginners. But just a little bit of basic setup that we need to do for what we're doing here is if you are selecting an object, say for example, I select with my left mouse here. If you're finding that you're moving around this red and white 3D cursor, in other words, it's going like that, go ahead and put that back. Shift S, cursor to center. And you want to select with a different mouse button. You can come up here to File, go into User Preferences, go to Input, and you can select which one you want to select your mouse button with to use as the selection key. Once you do that, you can choose Save User Settings. And we'll close this down. Another thing that we need to do is change our windows around a little bit. You'll notice when you first start Blender for the very first time, it'll come up with a setup very similar to this. And this window down here, this window pane, is the animation timeline. We're not going to be using that in this lesson or in this course, so I'm going to go ahead and remove that. The way to do that is just come down here until you see the double arrow right at the edge of this selection here. Right click and choose Join Area. And as you move back and forth, you'll see an arrow go back and forth. And I'm just going to point it downward here so that that window becomes the main window. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new window pane. So I'm just going to come up here where you see these little edges here and use the left button to drag this out. And as you can see, that creates a new window. I'm going to use my T key here to remove the tools because we don't need that for right now on both of these windows. And by the way, whenever you see me doing any of these actions in here, you'll see the keyboard shortcuts that I'm using by looking down here at this little box here. It also shows the right and left mouse clicks and also the mouse wheel. Another thing that I like to do, and this is just my preference, you'll see that these windows are in user perspective mode. I choose the number 5 on my numpad and choose it to orthographic. I just prefer to work in orthographic mode. So I'm going to choose 5 over here as well. And you can change the different views of the windows by choosing on your numpad. For example, number 7 is the top view, and I can come over here and number 3 is the right view. And as you make settings on this, if it's something that you want to use every time you open Blender, then you can always come over here to File and choose Save Startup File. I'm going to choose OK to save it. And that will change it so that every time you open Blender, you'll see these same settings that you made. Okay, so we're going to be modeling a fairly basic cube type of model structure. And in order to do that, you'll need a reference image. And if you go to the attachments, you'll be able to see the reference image that you need. And it's just called Cube Object. Once you have that image downloaded, just come over to this window here and come down to your properties here, change this from the 3D view, and we're going to use the UV image editor. Once you have this view here, I'm going to come down here and choose Open. And you need to find where you store that image on your hard drive. In my case, it's in a folder called Reference Images. So I'm going to choose this and choose Open Image. And that should open up your image here. And if you don't see the whole image, you can use your mouse wheel to zoom out so that you can see it fairly well. And what we're going to do is we're going to duplicate this image by creating it in 3D. So as you can see, just looking at this object, I mean, it's very, very much angular. It's all made basically with cubes. So as you might guess, we can start with the cube. And if you don't have the cube here, you can always choose Shift A, go to Mesh, and add a cube from here. So in order to create this object, we need to think about how we need to go about adding on to it. Well, with our basic cube in object mode, this is pretty much as far as we can do, because all we can do with this object in object mode is we can scale it, rotate it, and move it. So we need to be able to manipulate it a little bit more than that. And I'm just going to go into the 3 side view and just set it on top there so we can work with it. So it's setting right on the grid. And now I'm going to tab into edit mode. So this allows us to do a little bit, or actually a lot more, with our geometry and as far as shaping our object. So you'll notice by default the entire cube is selected. If you don't want anything selected, you can choose A to deselect, or toggle A again to select everything. So looking at this object, we can see that some of the largest objects we have are these 3 big parts of the cube. So we need to make those first. So I'm just going to come down here and choose faces. And I'm going to choose back face here and choose E extrude. And when you do that, E on the keyboard, you'll see this line that's going out. The reason that this line is going out the direction it is because of the direction of this face that is highlighted. It knows that the face is pointing that way, so it automatically gives you the option to extrude it in that direction, which in this case is exactly what we want. So I'm just going to extrude it out, move it out a little bit here, and select off of it. Then I'm going to come over here and I'm going to choose this face, E extrude again. Again, it gives us the guideline that we want, and I'm just extruding outward. So we've already created this basic 3 cube shape that we see here. So now we need to think about how we're going to create these other little objects that are coming out of these cubes. Well, we know that if we just choose this face and we try to extrude it outward like we did before, we're not going to get anything like this side. So in order to get these smaller parts, we need to start subdividing our cube so that we can begin to model these other areas. So in order to do that, we're going to do a Control R edge loop. And when you do that, if you move around the object, you'll notice that it's going to divide the object in different ways depending on where your mouse is at. So in this case, I'm going to come over here. So it's going to divide these 2 cubes here. And I'm going to move my mouse wheel up 1 time and then select off of it. Now, if I just select off of it once, I can move this around, which I don't want. So I want to select off of it twice, and that'll put it right in the center where we want. Oh, and I just realized that we forgot this top cube here. So I'm going to go back into face view, and I'm just going to select this face, shift select these other faces, choose E to extrude, and just move this up like so. Now I've created a little bit more subdivisions here, but it's okay in this case because we actually need this subdivision in order to get this little cube coming out right here. Okay, so we're going to do the same thing with these other parts. I'm going to choose Control R. And as you see, I'm moving right to this area here, so it'll subdivide in this area. And I'm going to move the mouse wheel up once and then select it again, so it's right in that area. So now we're planning for these subdivisions coming out as far as the long way of the cube, but what about the height of the cube? So for example, what I mean is if I choose faces right now, I can choose this face and extrude it, but I'm not getting this short cube. So I'm going to Control Z, undo that twice. So as you might imagine, we need to subdivide some more in order to get the shapes that we want. So I'm going to choose Control R to subdivide. And you can see right here, if I put the mouse right here, it's going to subdivide along this area. So I'm going to select the mouse once. And while that's selected, I can move it around. So I'm just going to move it down here because this is about the size of this extrusion here. And as you can see, it gives us this little square here that we'll be able to extrude. Same thing on this other side. Now we also have these little cubes here. So I'm going to come up here and do a Control R and select that once, and you can move it around. And I'm just going to move it right about there and select it again so that it places this subdivision, this edge loop right there. And then we also have this little piece coming out here. So I'm going to choose Control R again and select it, and then I can move it around, and I'm just going to make it right about there. and select it again so that it's a permanent edge loop there. So now we have enough geometry, enough subdivisions in order to create some of these other segments that are extruding from our main objects here. So we could stay in edge mode because when we create an edge loop, it automatically puts us in edge mode. And we could come over here and we could choose this edge, shift select this edge, shift select this edge, and shift select that edge and do an extrusion. But that's a little bit of a hard way to do it. So what we're going to do is choose face, select. So that way we can just choose this face, choose extrude. Again, it's extruding along the axis that we want it to. So we're just going to extrude this out like so. We're not going to worry about this little angle right there at this moment. We're going to do that in a minute. Then we're going to come out and make these little cubes here. So choose the face, extrude, just pull that out. Choose this face, extrude, pull that out with the mouse. And now we have these two to do. So I'm just going to choose this, extrude, pull that out. And you'll notice that we have a little bit of a slope here. It's almost like a curve right there, but we'll get to that in a minute. So we're going to go ahead and create this extrusion here. So choose this face, extrude, scale it out. Now we need this to go up, but we don't have any geometry to do that. So there's a couple of ways that you can do this. You can choose Control R and create an edge loop along this extrusion and move it to where you want. So when you do that and go to face, you'll have this part that you can extrude upwards. Or if I Control Z undo all this, you can also move this back a little bit and extrude and move this forward like so. You just basically did the same thing. You created an edge loop there, an extrusion, so that you have the geometry necessary in order to extrude upward. So just a couple of different ways to do that. So I'm going to choose this face here, extrude, and notice it's extruding along the axis of the face. So I'm just going to move it up like so. And now we need to make this this other little extrusion here. In order to do that, we're going to choose extrude, but we're going to click off of that. We're not going to move it at all. And then we're going to use the scale key, the S key. So S, scale that down. And once we have this extrusion here, which is basically a subdivision, we extrude, and then we can extrude that upward. Now, another thing that you can do here, same type of operation, is you can choose extrude, select off of that, S to scale it down, and then extrude and just scale it downward like so. That way you've made it sort of a pipe tube or something like that. Okay, so basically we've just created this object, but there's a couple of more things we need to do. We need to create this angle that's going on here. So in order to do that, we don't really need to add any more geometry. What we can do is we can go into Edge, select only this edge, and just drag it back like so. And that'll make that little curve there. The other thing that we need to do, or actually the last thing we need to do, is we need to create this slope that's going on with this extrusion. So in order to do that, we don't really have the geometry necessary to do that, because if we tried to choose this face, I mean, we could choose extrude, scale it down, and try to pull this up and kind of get there a little bit, but that's not the correct way to do it. I'm just going to Control Z undo all that. So in order to get any kind of a curve type shape, you need more points to work with, and you need more geometry. So I'm going to choose Control R, and right here on this cube shape, as long as you see, your edge loop's going to fall in there, I'm going to mouse wheel up 3 times. Actually, let's do 4 times. And I'm going to select that and then select again so they'll all be centered. And then I'm just going to choose 3 on my nub pad to go into side view. Actually, that's not showing me what I need to do. Let's go into 1 front view. And I'm just going to zoom in here so I can see this. And then I'm going to choose vertex select so I can select these individual vertices. Now, one thing you have to be careful here is once we select these vertices, say if I try to select these vertices and I'm going to do a B box select, and I move this up, and then we look at it by holding down the middle mouse button. We notice that we only moved one of these vertices. So I'm going to undo that, go back into one front view. The reason that it's not selecting the vertex behind it is because this occlude is turned on. And that means that we can only select the visible geometry that we see. So I'm going to turn this off. And when we do that, and I choose B box select, you'll notice that it's selecting the geometry that's directly behind it. And that's something that is very important to remember, because a lot of times you will be working in front view or side view or top view, and you'll need to move geometry around or manipulate geometry, and you won't be able to do it correctly because this is either turned off or turned on depending on what you're trying to do. So now with that turned off, what I'm going to do is I'm going to B box select this geometry here, and I'm just going to pull it up. Actually, I should have took this one too. Just B box select that. I'm just going to pull that up. And then I'm going to B box select this one here. Actually, let's do both of these here. Pull these up. And I'm just going to do a Control R, add another edge loop right here. B box select this, and I'm just going to pull it up just slightly more so we have sort of that curved surface. And you can change this around any way that you feel like it. Okay, so now if I hold down my middle mouse button and kind of look at the object that we have, and if I tab back into object mode, you can see that we've recreated the object that we intended to create. So if this is your first model that you've created with Blender, it might be something that you're kind of proud of creating and you want to share and you want to render and take an image of and all that good stuff. So what I'm also going to cover in this lesson is how to set up a basic scene by giving it a little bit of a background and set up your lighting and render the image. So in order to do that, let's go ahead and create a floor plane for this. So I'm going to choose Shift A, go to Mesh and choose Plane. Then I'll put a plane at the bottom here, and I'm just going to choose S to scale. And you can scale this however large you want to. And this will be kind of our floor plane. And by the way, when you create any kind of object, 3D object in Blender, it's going to create it where this red and white 3D cursor resides. So if you accidentally, like sometimes I'll right click by accident out here somewhere and move the 3D cursor where, somewhere where if I do a Shift A, create a cube, it's now going to create it somewhere where I didn't want it, because normally you want to create things within the center. I'm just going to X-delete that. If that happens, we can just move this 3D cursor back to the center by doing a Shift S and choose Cursor to Center. And then when you create any kind of object, it'll put it right there at the center of that 3D cursor. And by the way, since we've come this far, it's a good idea to always save your work. So I'm just going to do a File, Save As. And I created one of these before when I was testing this out, but I'm just going to name it the same thing, cubeobject.blend. And if you want to download this file, I'm going to include it with this lesson. So it'll be within the attachments. And I'm just going to choose Save Blender File. And there we have our saved blend file. So in order to render this and get a saved image of it, what we can do is we need to set up our camera and our lighting. So first let's look at the lighting. By default, you will have a sun object in your scene. If you don't, just choose Shift A and you'll see under lamp, you can create different types of lamps, and we'll use the sun for this scene. So if we go over to our properties here, just going to move this over, you'll see if you have the sun selected, you'll see this selection here, which is your lamp selection. And if you, right now mine's a point lamp, so I'm going to change this to sun. Notice that you can change it into different types of lamps. And I'm going to leave it at a power of 1. And over here I'm going to choose 3 on the numpad to go into the right view. And I see that the sun's kind of at an angle, which is fine. I'm just going to rotate that a little bit. I'm going to choose 1 front view on the numpad. And this is also at an angle, so that's fine with me. I'm just going to leave it at an angle like that. Then I'm going to come over here to the world settings. and I'm going to change the backdrop a little bit. Right now, by default, it's sort of this gray backdrop, so I'm going to change the color by clicking here, and I'm going to make it brighter. And we'll just make this kind of a little bit blue there. And if you like, you can check these, which is going to give the background a little bit of a blending effect. But for mine, I'm just going to leave it at solid blue here. Once you have that, we need to make sure that our camera is positioned correctly. So the easiest way to do that is choose your camera, select your camera, and I'm going to come over to this window, and I'm going to change from our UV image editor because we don't really need to see this image anymore. I'm going to change back to the 3D view, and if your camera is selected, you can choose Control 0 on the numpad, and that will show you exactly what the camera is seeing when it's selected. And of course, for just about everything that you can do with your keyboard shortcuts, you can also do through the menus. So in order to get this view of the camera, say if I was to go into 3 side view again and I wanted this to be the active camera view over here, I can come down to View and then Cameras, and I can set the active object as camera. And you can see over here also, this is the shortcut that I used before. So it's the same thing. So once you see the camera view here, what I normally do over here in order to adjust it a little bit is I choose 7 on the numpad to go into top view. And I can scroll down on my mouse wheel a little bit to see what I'm seeing. And while the camera is selected, I just choose G to move it. And that way you can kind of move it around and get it where you want it to be. You can also come over here, because it's selected here, choose G, and you can move it around this way. And as far as that goes, you can rotate it if you need to. So this is almost the view I want, but it's cropped in too much, so I'm going to choose G, ZZ, and that will actually dolly out of the view like so. So that's a pretty good view there. So once you have your camera set up, you have your lighting and your camera set up, and you're seeing pretty much how you want to render your image, then you can come over here to the properties again, and we're going to go to render settings. And by the way, for this example, I'm using the Blender render engine. That's the built-in render engine that Blender has. Normally, I work in Cycles render, and as we do later lessons, I will probably switch over to the Cycles render in order to render our objects. So there's some things you need to check on your render settings. For example, the resolution. Mine's set pretty high. I don't want it that high, so I'm going to click on this and choose 1280. Tab down to this and choose 720. Tab down to that, and I'm going to make this 100 so it shows it's rendering at 100% of that size. The reason that you might change this to 50% is if you have a real high resolution here and you just want to get sort of like an idea of how it's rendering out without having to wait all that time for it to render a large image, you could bump this this percentage down if you needed to. Now 1280 by 720, that's your basic high definition size or high quality size, so that's what I'm going to use for this. And that's pretty much the basic settings, all the basic settings you need. You might want to change this to whatever format you want to save to. So I'm going to change this to JPEG just because I want to save it as a JPEG. Or you can leave it as PNG, it doesn't matter. And then again, once you change some of these basic settings, say, for example, when you render something, you always do your test renders or maybe even your final renders at this size, then you may want to come over here to File and Save Startup File. So I'm going to save that. So now every time I open Blender, I'm going to have this as the startup file. I'm going to go ahead and do a Control S Quick Save. Hit Enter to save that. And now we can do a quick test render. And in order to render, you could come up to your render window here and choose Render Image F12, but it's easier just to get in the habit of choosing F12 to render. So we've rendered our object, and as we can see, lighting isn't that great right now. It's kind of blocking out some of our image here. So I'm going to choose Escape on the keyboard, and then we can kind of see what the sun is doing here. It's kind of going off at that angle. So I'm going to choose, let's see, one front view. Actually, let's do 3 side view, and let's R rotate. Choose the sun, and R rotate this back that way a little bit. That way, the sun is kind of pointing in the direction of our camera. In fact, we can kind of mimic the camera direction a little bit by rotating that, or rotate that over a little bit. And if we go to 7 top view, yeah, it's pretty much pointing that way, so that's okay. So we just change the sun a little bit, do a F12 render again. And now you can see that your view is coming up a little bit better. Now, your render, of course, is pretty boring because it's all grayscale, pretty much except for the background. So another thing you can do is add some materials to your object. So I'm going to choose Escape, and I'm just going to choose my floor here, go over to Materials in my Properties, choose New Material, and I can name this, click in there and name it Floor. And I'm not going to get into changing specifically the materials at this point. I'm just going to go into the colors and change it, just give it a little bit of color just so there's something there to look at. And same thing with our object here. In materials, I'm going to change this material name to, just call it Cube Object like we did the file. And I'm just going to give it, I don't want to change it to blue because that'll mesh with the background or conflict with the background. So just give it kind of a greenish color, I guess. Okay, Control S, quick save. And I'm in the habit of just saving every time I do some kind of major operation. So I'm just giving you the idea that get in the habit of saving your work because, as you well know, computers can crash and programs can crash. Okay, so I'm just going to choose F12 to render that out. So it's a little bit more interesting now. It's got some color to it. And if we go back to our image, if we go back here to choose the UV image editor, you'll see that I had some edges on this image. And the way I did that, just for, if you're curious, if you go to render settings, you can use something called Blender Freestyle, which is right here. Check that. And if we pull this arrow down, you can see that you have some options here. I'm just going to leave them at the default. And I'm going to F12 render again. And you'll notice that what Freestyle does is it puts edges along the object that you're rendering. So once you're happy with the final render of your object, you can come down here to Image, do a Save as Image, and I'm just going to put this one in my reference images. And I'm going to call this one Cube Object 2. And I'm going to choose Save as Image. So once you've created your first model and you've saved it in image, you can then attach it in email and send it off to friends and let them be amazed at your new modeling ability. But here is your assignment to work on for this lesson. I escape from this image and go back to our model here. What I would like you to do is tab in edit mode, and you don't necessarily have to do it on this object, but I would like you to start working with manipulating the object in all the different ways and get used to moving this geometry around, scaling it, extruding it, rotating it, whatever options you can think of to do. For example, and if you see all these lines, it's because we've turned occlude off. It might be easier to work with it on in this case. So I'm going to turn it back on. And I'm just going to choose faces. And that way you can choose here and choose, you can either just start moving things, extrude things, choose E, select off of it, scale it down, extrude. You can also work with the edges and vertices, so I'm going to choose vertex select. So you can choose vertex and start moving these around. You can choose shift select these two vertices here. I'm going to choose SX to scale on the X, SX. I can move those both in that way. And I'm going to choose face, select this face, go into 3, side view, and then I can R rotate this if I want to. So play around with the rotation, play around with the G move tool, S to scale, and of course the E to extrude. All of that allows you to create an object that you're trying to create. Of course, this object doesn't really look like anything particular. It's kind of strange, but you get the idea that if you could take one of these objects and just start playing with it and start making these, doing these functions and get in the habit of, how this works, then when you think about moving something and you say, I want to scale this, you won't even think about hitting the S key. You'll just know to do it because you'll have done it so much. It just becomes sort of like second nature. So this is this object, but you can also do a Shift A, go to Mesh, and choose any of the primitives and start playing with those as well in order to see how this geometry reacts. So in other words, you can put in a sphere here, move it up out of the way, scale it up, go into tab and edit mode, and then you can start. I'm just shift selecting some faces here. E extrude, see how things react. R rotate, scale it down, that sort of thing. So this is just, a basic, very basic manipulation of geometry. As we move into our other lessons, we're going to get into a little bit more complicated geometry. I mean, not very much, because I don't want you to get overwhelmed, but I do want you to learn how to manipulate this geometry. I'm just going to do a F12 on this again. We have our strange object there. So definitely feel free to go wild and just start changing your object around using all those different functions that we learned about here. So in the next lesson, lesson 4, we're going to look at how to model an actual object, which is going to be a pyramid. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next lesson.